So thanks everyone for joining us on another Meridian West 30-minute webinar. Today we're tackling a really interesting and exciting topic, looking at what best-in-class client management looks like, and in particular doing that through two different lenses, looking at what professional firms are doing, but also looking at what lessons can be drawn, particularly from the B2B technology space, where I think there's lots of really great practice and interesting things happening. To help us do that, we've got two great experts. Ben Kent, who many of you know, founder director of Meridian West, is going to join to share some of his expertise from the professional services sector. I'm really delighted to have a kind of welcome return. In fact, some of you may know Joseph Minchin. Was a key member of the Meridian West team back in 2014, left us I think in 2018, has done some interesting work, particularly as I said in that kind of B2B tech space over the last 5 years or so. Most recently has founded Nyala Marketing to kind of take forward a lot of that work and do some really interesting things. So really kind of keen to hear his perspective. Lots of opportunities to throw in questions as we go along, and I'll be looking out for those, and we'll try and make some time at the end to pick Ben and Joe's mind on that. Before we dive in, just a very quick plug for our next webinar, which is on the 15th of June, so 2 weeks time, looking at AI in professional services. Lots of talk, but what we're trying to do is demystify that for you. So 30 minutes all around what's happening around AI in professional services. Is it all talk or actually what's happening on the ground? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben and Joe to take us through best-in-class client management.
Thank you very much, Alistair. So I think what I wanted to do is kind of focus on how client management is changing in professional services firms. I think most firms now have a CRM program. They're doing client feedback, but I think in some ways we're sort of grappling with almost having too much data. And so what we've been focusing on is kind of 4 key challenges. First of all, how do you use technology to make sense of all that data? How do you get the key account team, the right key account team together? How do you provide kind of really bespoke insight at a time when people are getting inundated with information? And last but not least, how do you foster a kind of commercial kind of sales focus amongst kind of fee earners? And we're going to give examples of best practice and both from what we're seeing in the professional services world, but also I think there's a lot we can learn from B2B tech businesses, which is why Joe is here. So let's just start with technology. Just going to share my screen. So Joe, what are you seeing in terms of technology?
So I think that's one of the things that always comes up with client relationship management, is it can quite quickly become a technology conversation straight off the bat. And I think part of the reason for that is that client management tech as part of MarTech have absolutely exploded over recent years. So the chart on the left is looking specifically at MarTech, of which client management technology is a subset. But essentially since 2011, it's grown from around about 150 tools on the market to this year over 11,000. It's crazy just how many tools there are out there to do how many sort of specific things. And then over on the right, don't worry about what all those little dots are, but essentially every one of those dots is a different piece of technology, and the bits that are highlighted in white are ones that can quite reasonably be sort of viewed as client management tech. And it's that there's just so much. And the point is with this is a lot of them are created and can do really fantastic things in data-driven businesses, and a lot of them designed for genuinely data-driven businesses. The thing is, when we're looking at things from a professional services point of view, these are people businesses, really, not necessarily data businesses. And I think it's quite easy often to say, right, I've got a challenge with client relationship management. Let's see if there's a tool that can plug that hole. Whereas often the issue is either a strategic challenge or an operational challenge. It's not often a tech challenge at its heart. And so whilst the kind of point I wanted to make here is that whilst they're absolutely is useful tech out there. It's rarely on its own the solution, especially if you're looking at tech which wasn't designed for the professional services market. It requires a lot of there's a lot of work that needs to be done when you take on a lot of these tools to actually get the value out of them. And I think one of the big examples here is that whenever we speak to professional services teams about CRM, their CRMs, for example, it's so common to hear that that kind of complaint of, oh, the data in the CRM's rubbish. I can't get out the information that I need. And the fact is, all of these tools require systems, processes, and people in place to support them. And so I think with that, it's quite useful to think of the challenges of client management, not necessarily entirely through a tech lens, but also through that sort of kind of people, process, and strategy lens as well.
Yeah, so in terms of, I think what you're saying is tech is not the kind of panacea, but in terms of the kind of other B2B organizations you've worked with outside of the professions, what's their kind of philosophy about using data? How do they go about doing that? It's a bit different from the professions.
I think one of the big things that I saw when I moved into the world of the wider B2B world, and particularly with B2B tech, was the data-driven approach to every single element of the client relationship. So that's viewing it from all the way from identification and acquisition of a target account through to onboarding them and then provisioning an ongoing service. All of that is done through the lens of data. Every single interaction is, when it's done well, there are lots that don't do it particularly well, when it's done well, every single interaction is tracked and monitored in a centralized platform. You'd never have a situation, or you'd rarely have a situation where you've got a relationship owner going and having a sort of new business conversation with a client, or a quarterly business review, where the insight from that doesn't get held in a central way and can't be accessed and aggregated and monitored, which I know is far less usual within the professional services space.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting. We had a round table this morning with lots of client insight kind of professionals from professional services firms, and it was the vast majority of those were just maybe collecting kind of client insights, once a year at the most. The only ones that didn't actually were the two firms that were serving insurance clients, and there they had incorporated getting feedback at post-pitch, the onboarding at different stages of the transaction. It just kind of became part of their way of working, but that's still quite rare, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's a case of making sure that you're comparing apples with apples with this with these things, because a lot of the B2B tech organizations were built on data. They're not particularly old, most of them. You're only looking sort of 20 years or a decade for a lot of them, and they were fundamentally built to be data businesses regardless of what they sell. And so it's an essential, the technology and the use of data is absolutely fundamental to their business model. It's not something that's had to be sort of bolted on and built in over a number of years on a far more or more of a legacy organization.
So I was going to just sort of share what we're seeing in the professional services space, because I think we are beginning to see some changes. And I think where, so from Meridian's perspective, we've been building kind of client insight dashboards for, I don't know, come up for 15 years. But my sense is the technology is really evolving. And I think the great opportunity and one which we're investigating and is how you integrate different information sources to really get a 360-degree view of the client, both in terms of their feedback on the service you're delivering, but also where their business is going, where their future needs are likely to be. And also summarized it here is how do you build a dashboard that, yes, collects client feedback, whether it's in-depth interviews or online surveys. I think there's also an opportunity to capture informal feedback. So the conversation a partner has with a client over lunch, particularly valuable is secondees who intimately get to know an organization, bringing that back, employees' views, who can give good insights on what's causing the friction points in terms of client service. The clients can identify the symptoms, the employees can identify the causes. data scraping news feeds, which gives you a heads up on how the client's business is evolving. We're also working with our sister company, Book Intelligence, that do company reports that identify client strategies and integrating with financial data. And we've been working on this for quite a while now. The idea is, how do we pull this all together and then curate the information in a way that surfaces the opportunities for kind of growing the relationships? And yeah, I think it's quite an exciting time. I think what it needs is that the technology is there through APIs and dashboarding sort of technology. It's really about how do you curate it and see the signals through the noise, and saying, okay, if a client says this, or if the company's doing that, what does that mean for us? And that is when you bring in the real expertise about understanding the sector.
Yeah, and I think with that, one of the things that's really I found really interesting about this when you showed me is that it's very much designed from the point of view of someone working in sort of business development or sort of client listening within the professional services space. And that's one of the fundamental things. It's probably potentially the data sources and the actual kind of tool as a whole isn't necessarily radically different from some other things that are out there, but it's how it's sort of set up to work within existing processes and firms. I think is quite an important element.
I totally agree, because the technology is the technology, but it's really about who's the different audiences within professional services firms that might use this. So, at one level, you've got the client relationship partner, the account managers. How do you surface the information that's directly relevant to a particular client and spot the opportunities and the risks? But also, you have a different audiences, which is the management team. How can they assess the performance of their firm globally, and how can they assess where they should be investing next year? And I think that's the art, really, is understanding your audience and curating the information. We've been talking for 10 minutes and we haven't spoken about AI yet, but now I am. I think the other thing which is fantastic about AI, and it's not just GPT, it's a range of AI tools, is how it's extremely useful in terms of text analytics, and how, particularly if you're doing lots of in-depth interviews, it can really facilitate the process. So, we do many in-depth interviews, and it's shown in option A. This is how we used to do it traditionally. We did an interview, we recorded it, it was then transcribed by a team based in Birmingham. The consultant then summarised and provided an executive summary. It was highly manual, quite time consuming. Took us, we turned these around in 5 days, and it cost about £80 to do that. Now, the possibility, we're now using AI to automate a lot of that. It's not 100%. It does need a review from a human, but the speed and the cost advantage are pretty significant. So, basically in 10 minutes, you can take a sound file, transcribe it, then create an executive summary, which is actually pretty good. But then you can go to the next stage, which is, okay, how do we take a lot of these interview transcripts and then code them up, categorize them so you can analyze them by themes, and then put them onto data visualization tool. And that's, again, is something that we're now able to do, and we're doing with a lot of the large law firms like Hogan Lovells and HSF. So I think quite an exciting use of technology, and it enables the client teams to really focus then on how do you implement some of this rather than getting bogged down in manual processes.
I think with the AI point, because there's the applications like this which are really tangible and you can do right now, but there's the possibilities of it for relationship management are really, really quite exciting or scary, depending on how you look at it. You're speaking to someone from one of the big CRM providers the other day, and essentially what they were saying was their kind of vision of what's going on is that AI supported relationship management is going to raise the sort of base level of service to such an extent that it potentially ceases to become good customer service, ceases to become a particular differentiator. I think that needs to be taken with a pinch of salt when you're talking about sort of professional services. But when you're looking at sort of the wider market, the idea that you can get things like up-to-date progress reports, that you can have really sort of well-crafted quality communications the instant that you need them, it's one of those things which at the moment is a point of distinctiveness for a lot of businesses, is going to become just part of the course.
I agree, and I think the other topic that I'm really interested in is how you can spot opportunities. So you can suck in information about what an organization is doing. You can do that almost in real time through kind of social listening or by reviewing annual reports. But then to say, okay, if a company's opening a new branch in this jurisdiction, what does that then mean in terms of the potential opportunities to upsell? And I don't think we're too far away from achieving that. Okay, so I think that's technology. Joe, do you want to talk about how tech businesses put together their key account team and how that's different from the professional services?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the more fundamental differences that you find when you look at the professions and then you look at other B2B organizations, and it's the role of the relationship owner, and the interaction between the whole business and the client is fundamentally quite different. And I think broadly speaking, there are kind of these two models that they can fall into, the sort of traditional model and the new model. And I know that a number of firms are moving more from the left to the right, but everyone's sort of on a continuum. But essentially in the traditional model, you have the relationship owner who effectively is sitting in between the client and the wider firm, than the wider business. So when the client needs something, they've got a query, a question, a concern, there's a new piece of work, whatever it is, the relationship is funneled through that relationship owner or relationship partner, who then reaches out to the wider organization and then acts as the face of the organization to the client. And there are obviously some really significant benefits to that around control, and around making sure that the sort of communication in the face is really consistent and really, really strong. That as a model is pretty unusual in my experience once you leave the professions and look elsewhere. There's always going to be a relationship owner that ultimately the health of the relationship is on their head, but there's a much broader relationship between the organization and the client. It's very, very common to see not just a broad delivery team having a wide relationship with the client with lots of different stakeholders, but also to see things like when it comes to product development, doing quite ad hoc product testing and co-creation with clients. When it comes to marketing and sales, there's far more of a direct relationship between those parts of the business and the client organization. And even when you're looking at finance, there'll be relationships, like sometimes quite strong or long-term relationships between individuals sitting within finance on the organization side and on the client side. So when challenges arise, quite often the individuals from the client account will be reaching out to stakeholders from across the wider business. And that's quite interesting. It's obviously, there's a higher level of risk with that, and it's harder to keep control of it. But I think the breadth of relationships that you end up having, there's kind of three key benefits to it. So one is that on the whole, the client experience tends to be stronger because they can access the insight, the information and these solutions to their problems normally far, far quicker by just going to the direct to the right person. I think it's quite interesting. It makes the relationship a lot stickier, because if you've got all of these tentacles out into the organization, shifting to a different provider is more difficult. You're going to be more reluctant to do it. But then the biggest one, which we've seen huge value from, is when it comes to opportunity spotting. If the relationship is just between relationship owner and GC, for example, yeah, you're having that strategic top level relationship, but your main stakeholder is extremely busy. They've got a particular lens on the organization. Whereas if you've got across the business dozens and dozens of relationships running out into this main client account, the opportunity for seeing particular challenges they might be facing or different directions that the business is going in that you can support with is absolutely huge. And I think that's one of they're kind of two quite different models. And I think there's probably a shift often from the left to the right, but at the moment, my sense is that a lot more of the professional firms are closer to the left, whereas almost all the B2B tech organizations I work with are very much on the right.
It's interesting because I do feel you're right, Joe. I think this is a massive challenge for professional services firms. So, we interview hundreds, maybe probably thousands of buyers of professional services. And the number one service issue they highlight to us is, we're absolutely fine when we deal with our main partner, but there's a huge lack of consistency if they move down to more junior staff or to a different office or a different service line. And so there's kind of seen as quite a, and therefore they default back to just going back to that kind of relationship owner. And so I think if you can kind of crack that consistency of service delivery and therefore deliver the whole firm, and that requires a kind of similar culture and similar processes worldwide. I think the second issue is that increasingly clients want to see not just the fee earners, but also other staff as well. The account managers, particularly on legal tech, they want to have access to the technologists, the project managers. So I think we will see quite a lot of change here in the next 10 years.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that as well is it's fundamental. It's not something you can just go and flick a switch overnight, but it requires more of a breakdown between the traditional front office, back office split, because that's a concept that you rarely come across when you, other than sort of in the FS space, but when you move out to professional services, it's a concept that is rarely there. Even in businesses like a lot of consultancy businesses and tech consulting businesses, where it's a similar hourly fee model, you come across the distinction between fee earners and back office or fee earners and business functions a lot less. And I think it all plays into that broadening of the relationship with clients.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the opportunities, if you can crack it, are fantastic. In terms of the stickiness of the relationship, but also if you're the firm that can truly deliver the whole firm to the client, you're at a huge advantage over your peers who can't. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. Keep the pace up. So kind of delivering personalised and kind of super useful content. So there's a lot of content out there from professional services firms. That's only going to get worse with ChatGPT. So how do technology businesses grapple with that, Joe?
Yeah, so I'm going to say, just to start with here, as a general rule, if you're looking for thought leadership best practice, I would keep your heads well and truly inside the professions. There is a lot of very, very poor pseudo thought leadership, as I'm sure everyone knows, that's ever been flogged to by a tech vendor. It's the most common practice seems to be, right, we're going to put together a sales brochure and then we're going to add a couple of lines of opinion at the beginning and call it a thought leadership report. A lot of it is not strong. Although sometimes it's quite effective, but that's probably a conversation for another day. But where there is some really interesting work going on in content is around the one-to-one creation of thought leadership. And this is stuff that you don't necessarily see, because by its very nature of being one-to-one, it's not sort of published, splashed all over websites and put out over LinkedIn, for example. But one piece I just wanted to very quickly touch on was a project that I worked on with a leading systems integrator tech consultancy a couple of years ago. And with them, supporting them in targeting, in kind of shifting perceptions within one of their big accounts, which was BT. And here what we actually did was we decided that in order to shift perception from a sort of a kind of transactional partner to being more of a genuine strategic partner, we needed to actually position ourselves as that kind of strategic advisor. And so what we did is we commissioned a significant study really that was entirely designed for BT, looking at how they can make the most of the capitalize on the 5G opportunity. And so we got in a top telecoms journalist, someone that had written for the Financial Times, interviewed a load of people, and then put together this absolutely bespoke heavyweight report that really broke down, based on our understanding of BT's business and what you do, how you're structured, this is how we would make the most of the opportunity, and then use that to drive the conversation forward with a load of C-suite execs. And it was really effective. I think it's one of those that you can look at and you can say, oh my goodness, that is what an investment to make on a single account. But when an account in this sense is worth multiple millions of pounds per year, it is worth the investment provided it's considered.
Really interesting, and I think that we're beginning to see personalised thought leadership in professional services. So, you know, quite often there will be, after a kind of piece of research, there'll be one-to-one kind of follow-up meetings with key clients. We're seeing that, and that's more of a focus than the brand building. I think one particularly interesting area is using kind of benchmarking surveys. So we've seen a real growth in that. We've been developing this technology that where you would do a 10-minute, 15-minute survey with a client. But then what we do is we take that data and we create an interactive dashboard that enables them to compare their results to the peer group that they choose. So we've been doing this a lot with the big four, also with Alan Overy and BDO, and it works super well. So, you know, on one campaign, we were looking at, you know, the legal department and how they were innovating, and we could create benchmarks so banks could compare themselves to other banks, and we created an overall maturity score, so identified where they're in the top quartile, where they needed to develop, and then exported that into a PowerPoint deck, and then used that to create one-on-one meetings with the partners from that firm. And, you know, that generated well over 100 one-on-one high value meetings, a huge value to the client. So I think we're beginning to see changes there. Just conscious of time, so our last challenge is the commercial mindset and how sales orientated technology businesses are.
Yeah. So oh, sorry.
No, go on. So what are you seeing in
yeah,
technology?
so I was going to say, given we've only got 3 minutes, so I can't go into a great deal of depth. I would just say the main point is, fundamentally, relationship management in a lot of businesses outside professional services is seen as effectively a sales or growth function. The whole point of a good client experience is to drive more revenue, to win new clients, to increase the amount of work that you do with existing clients, and to keep them. And so what I see a lot of is there's a lot of ambition when it comes to managing relationships. They take a very strategic, rigorous approach to managing those relationships, and then they measure the effectiveness of what they do in commercial outcomes, and they hold the account team, which will generally consist of a very cross-functional team, they hold them to account for the revenue that's generated that year. And that is a big difference, is actually viewing it as commercially valuable rather than as a nice to have or something with intrinsic value.
And how do the clients take that? Do they feel sold to?
No, I really think clients expect to be sold to. They know that they're not, that everyone's not just in it for the goodness of their hearts. They know they're being sold to. There's a definite line to tread, and lots do go far too salesy, but you can have a good, profitable commercial relationship without constantly flogging stuff to people. But that's probably a broader conversation.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're beginning to see this in professional services. So I think on client feedback, for example, we're asking much more direct questions about where the client's business going, what are their strategies, where they might need support from their professional advisors. We're asking about share of wallet, and we're asking about services they might be interested in having a conversation with. And we have absolutely no problem getting people to answer these questions. We do make them optional, but the insights you get are just fantastic. And of course, the partners love it because it kind of develops future opportunities for them, and it really gets them to buy into any client feedback program. So it's a bit of a canter, but I thought we'd just sort of summarize with kind of some of the 4 challenges we've discussed about. So I think, first of all, the technology. I think our conclusion here is it's, yes, technology is helpful, but it's really understanding who's your audience and how do you curate the information and think about your processes. On the account team, Joe, your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I think on the account team, it's looking at who's actually involved in managing the who's actually involved in managing that account, who makes it up, who's responsible for it, and also potentially looking at it's far more common to have very strong financial incentives for managing relationships, and so it's looking at how do you incentivize people to actually get involved in it and do it.
On personalised content, I think it's very much focused upon this as creating one-to-one, highly valuable personalised content. It's easier to show ROI because you can link it directly to sales, but I think to show some of the creativity and look at some of the new tools that are emerging. I mean, the final point on commerciality, Joe.
Yeah, I think it's just looking at who's involved in that account strategy and to look at balancing the efforts that you're making in relationship management against the financial returns.
Perfect. Thank you. So I think we've got to the half hour.
You did. That was a speedy run through, and I feel like you've just scratched the surface of what could have been a whole afternoon seminar. But thank you so much, Joe. Thank you so much, Ben. I think lots of food for thought. Interesting to hear the kind of compare and contrast professional services, technology. I think some kind of key lessons to take away from what was being said there. I know we did have one question in from Leslie, which was just a question about AI, and particularly around transcription. Ben, you were kind of referencing that before in terms of, the speed. Any thoughts around the kind of best technologies you're using there, just to address Leslie's question?
Yeah, I think there's a number of tools out there. I think embedded in Teams now, you can get to transcripts, which aren't at all bad. The one we use is Descript, which has some quite nice functionality. From a doing client interviews perspective, you can also then turn the video file into short video clips as well. So that's a really nice add-on. I think there's also technologies that help you kind of identify themes and code it up as well, but that's a more specialist thing.
Great, thanks, Ben. So just a reminder, we're going to be having a deeper dive into the world of AI, and I think probably explore some of this in a bit more detail in 2 weeks' time. If you haven't registered for that, we'll put the link in the chat. But thank you so much once again, Joe and Ben, and thank you everyone for joining us today.